Hi everyone, this is a video tutorial for chapter 10, problems number 3 and 4. I have a new problem up here on the screen. It's the same type of problem, but the numbers are going to be the same on your end. So when I assign homework, I often will give you guys different numbers just to keep it challenging, and also so that you have the practice of kind of the numbers regenerating if you want to redo the problem. This problem you can find in your Blackboard view. So I'll point that out. It's in your chapter 10 folder at the bottom. It's called not homework. I wanted to make it clear this is not additional homework, but rather for a tutorial. Chapter 10, problem number 4, video tutorial, cash flow translation. This is what it looks like in the homework software, which is similar to what you've already seen for purposes of your homework. And finally, I'm going to do the demo mostly in the spreadsheet, okay? The spreadsheet is meant to sort of do a few things. Number one, just model out how you can approach a problem like this. When I assign this, I encouraged you guys or asked you guys to use a spreadsheet. You certainly can use paper if that's your preference, but I do want to encourage you guys to kind of stretch outside your comfort zone with respect to the spreadsheet skills. I also want to talk through some of the major concepts that we're going to see here. And finally, I'm going to point out a small bug in the software that you might hit upon in walking through the problem. It has to do with some rounding, a rounding issue, and it has to do with net income on the cash flow statement. Let's go through all of it now. So the first thing to note is that I always take everything from the problem and I like to lay everything out in my spreadsheet. So I have all the information in one spot. So that's what I've done up here at the top. The second thing is never let this information kind of sit within a paragraph. It's gonna be overwhelming. So what you wanna do is you wanna figure out, okay, let's break it apart into literally its parts, each financial fact kind of laid out on its own. And we're going to do that below with, I've made a mini income statement, and also I have the statement of cash flows, which is the basis of the problem. I also copied in our exchange rates. Now, what I did was I created, for purposes of this tutorial, the income statement, and I did that because I really want to emphasize that this statement of cash flow problem is difficult, and it requires us to think through the income statement and how the income statement is constructed and what the information is on the income statement. Statement of cash flows and kind of this idea of starting out with net income and then kind of like adjusting down to actual cash flow from various activities, it requires that we understand the other financial statements. So that's kind of an implied skill here, which is one of the things that makes this a difficult problem. I want to also note that your book here is going to be really, really important and very helpful. Learning objective number 3 walks through all of this. I want you to use your book as a reference and as a resource, in addition to this tutorial and in addition to kind of the slide deck and some of the other things that that I've at least emphasized for purposes of this topic. Let's go back to the worksheet and I'll talk through some of the concepts that are being laid out in the book and with this problem. So the first thing to note is that our income statement, right, we know that it's revenue minus expense, but there's some nuance here. First thing to note is that the rent revenue, the interest expense, and the depreciation expense, we all have to compute, right? So I've shown that in the worksheet. I'm gonna highlight up here in my formula bar, I have $8,600 of rent, which is the fact given to us in the problem, times 12 months. So I kind of had to extrapolate out, okay, what's a full year of rent? The repairs was pretty straightforward. That's a one-time expense. But then the interest expense is going to be, again, we have to compute that, and that's going to be a full year of interest expense because we're doing January through December 31st times 10%. Because again, we need to like kind of almost think back to previous accounting courses and think through how do you compute interest expense? And it's of course principal times the interest rate. And then finally, depreciation expense, we're given this building that has to be depreciated. We're given the 234,000 pound value of the building, and we're told it has a 10-year useful life with no salvage value. So that depreciation expense for 1 year, we have to compute that. It's gonna be the value of the building divided by the 10 years. Okay, so that's just laying out simply the numbers on the functional currency side. I have a subtotal for total expense and then my net income down here at the bottom in functional currency. I haven't yet gotten to the US dollar conversion. And by the way, none of this is required for purposes of your homework problem. You're not required to input net income, but you do need to refer to net income, which is why I'm laying this out and why I would encourage you guys, if it's helpful, like lay some of this extra detail out because it might help you think through the cash flow piece. Okay, leading into the cash flow, let's go over cash related to our income statement. We're told that rent revenue consisted of $103,200, right? But we're also told that some of that was cash and some of it was account receivable. So I put a little note here on the screen that we've got account receivables in our rent revenue. Of course, that means that some of our revenue does not include cash payment, right? So we're gonna have to consider that when we get to the cash flow statement. Secondly, interest expense. Well, I'm accounting for a full year of interest expense on my income statement, but note that the problem tells us that the actual cash payment is not due till January 1st. Well, that matters because this income statement is dated as of December 31st. So this interest expense is not yet cash, meaning it's incurred. We're going to show that we've incurred it, but we have not yet paid it with cash, and that's going to matter below as well in the cash flow statement. And finally, depreciation expense. We learn about this kind of when we first learn about depreciation. It's not a cash expense. So we have to just say, I'm going to put a note in there, okay, not cash. Okay, so we have our income statement. Now let's look at translating it into US dollar. Now, one of the things we learned is that exchange rates that, or I should say activity, functional currency activity that occurs over a time period, which is the income statement, right? Sales and expense occurring over a period of time. We're going to use the average rate because what we want to do is we want to kind of almost reflect that the activity, like for instance, revenue, that's occurring over a period of time. So we're going to use the average rate to capture that activity and to translate it into US dollar. If you notice, I simply grab my exchange rate up top. I'm going to point out an Excel tip here. I put dollar signs in front of my reference, and that allows me to copy down, and I get my US dollar amounts. And there we go. I've got my income in US dollar in addition to the functional currency. We're going to need to know that down below, this is the exchange rate we need. It's the average rate, $3.54 per pound. Now let's go down to the cash flow statement.